Welcome to the Doggy Dojo. I'm your host, Susan Light, a Los Angeles-based dog trainer and behavior consultant on a quest to become worthy of the title Sensei of the Doggy Dojo. Today we're talking about what it's like inside the animal shelters here in America. I want to give you a trigger warning. This is not necessarily a happy episode. We discuss euthanasia and animal cruelty. If this is not something you want to hear about, I totally understand. Skip this episode with no guilt. You might wonder why we're even talking about this. Because it's part of the reality of pet ownership in our country. Even if you've never adopted a pet from a shelter, your tax dollars support the city shelters. I think people don't really understand what shelters are forced to deal with day to day. This is the stuff I didn't know before I got into this business, and I think it could change the way some people think about the whole system. So that's why we're talking about it. If you're still here, my guest is a certified canine behavior consultant who specializes in severe behavioral issues. She's worked with dogs for 10 years and has 7 years of experience in the training and behavior modification realm. Throughout her career, she's worked and volunteered in various shelters, animal controls, and rescue organizations, primarily working hands-on with the dogs who are displaying behavioral concerns. Outside of working in shelters, she works full-time through her business, Columbia Canine Training and Behavior, helping clients and their dogs work through and overcome behavioral challenges, and spreading the force-free message through her Instagram account, The Future is Force-Free. Please welcome Jenna Pellerito. Jenna, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I think very few people really understand what it's like inside a shelter. It's incredibly tough on the animals and the humans, physically and emotionally. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like working in a shelter?
Yes. So working in a shelter is so incredibly challenging. A lot of people don't realize how challenging it really is unless you're in it. It's of course very rewarding, but it's also very heartbreaking and just really gut-wrenching. There's always that funny comment that people love to make that I'm sure we all know, which is oh, you're so lucky to play with puppies and kittens all day.
Yeah.
Which we kind of do. Shelter workers, sure, we play with puppies and kittens kind of, but in reality, shelter workers are actually witnessing puppies and kittens and everything in between suffer every single day at the stake of the shelter system. And our job is then to provide care for those animals who are suffering and try to reduce the overall suffering, regardless if they came into the shelter with a pre-existing condition, due to cruelty or neglect, or if the shelter system has actually just taken a toll on them and that's why they're suffering now. And most people find themselves working in shelter. Pretty much anyone who's working in shelter is extremely empathetic.
Yeah.
Of course, which why else would you work in a shelter if you weren't empathetic? It's not like we're there for the pay. Most shelter workers are actually being paid minimum wage. So we're clearly there for other reasons. And of course, with that, it's quite daunting as a highly empathetic person to go into a facility every day where there's all of this suffering and you still have to do the job that you came in to do. And you can't really allow your empathy to fully wash over you and take over, because you have to obviously be emotional and empathetic, but you also have to be emotionless and non-reactive, because if you were working with your emotions as you're witnessing everything, you're not going to really be able to do your job.
It's kind of like a doctor, right? You have to get this distance a little bit to do it.
Yeah, it's a crazy balancing act. Oh my gosh, I am so empathetic. I feel so horrible for all of these animals and I need to help them. But then I can't be in that mindset when I'm there, because you're not going to be able to do what you need to do, or actually make decisions like you need to.
Yeah. And I don't think people realize how difficult a lot of the decisions facing shelter workers are right now.
No. It is not a fun time at all.
Yeah.
By any means.
Yeah. It's also incredibly stressful for the animals who reside inside the shelter. Obviously, what's the day in the life of a shelter dog?
So really it varies from shelter to shelter. But especially if we're talking typical municipal county shelter animal control, Really, the large majority of the dogs are spending upwards of 24 hours a day in their kennel. Um,
Mm.
they're really, unfortunately, getting the bare minimum. And also to preface this, like I'm not, we're talking about this in like a educational way. Like this
Right.
isn't to like say, oh, shelters aren't doing enough. Really, in reality, like they're doing what they can. But most shelters or most shelter dogs that are in like a county type shelter, they have a water bucket and maybe a cot to lay on, and that's it. That's all that they get in their kennel. These shelters are so overcrowded
Mm.
and they're so understaffed that it's a safety hazard to really give the dogs anything else because they can't really oversee it. They can't see like, oh, what dog is ripping up a toy and swallowing it, or like
Yep.
breaking their teeth on a bone, or this and
Yep.
that. So they get a water bucket and then like a bowl of food once a day, and that's literally it. And of course, they're probably not sleeping well because it's noisy, it's stressful. Even the heat, the shelters down here in South Carolina that I've been at are mostly open air. So
Mm.
it's like a, you know, they have an indoor run and an outdoor run, and then there's like a fence and a roof around it, basically. So it's not air conditioned. And in the summer, like those rooms are hot, extremely hot. So there's also that. The dogs are probably really uncomfortable. They're probably waking up in a panic because they're hearing, you know, about 200 other dogs barking.
Yeah.
They might be able to look forward to enrichment time. If they're lucky, maybe a volunteer or a shelter worker will take them out for 10 minutes, you know? So really, like in a municipal shelter, the dogs are pretty much just sitting in their kennels all day and not able to do anything other than potentially panic or become more stressed. Sometimes even, especially in overcrowded municipal shelters, a dog might be housed in a kennel with one or two other dogs.
Yeah.
So
Because there's so many
yeah.
more dogs than there supposed to be in these shelters right
Oh
now.
yeah, like
Yeah.
an insane amount of dogs, which is like sometimes we might think like, oh, that's better. Like they have a friend. But from at least what I have witnessed with dogs being doubled up or tripled up in kennels, it actually just becomes a lot of fighting.
Mm.
And they're fighting for their resources or their space, or I mean they're trapped in a teeny kennel and
And
they can't
stressed
move away
out.
from each other, you know.
Yep.
So they're either taking it out on each other or they're getting into altercations because they can't get away from each other, which is even almost even worse.
Yeah.
But of course, there's amazing shelters that like have resources to get dogs out of their kennels and provide stimulation for them. But even in a shelter who has all the resources, like maybe a private shelter that has tons of volunteers and tons of staff, and they don't have as many dogs, the dogs even there are still probably spending 22 hours, if not more, in their kennel. You know, so even in a shelter who has all of the resources that they possibly could ever have, they're still spending the large majority of the day in the kennel.
Yeah. So this one was not on my list. It's just occurring to me now. So if we don't want to talk about it, we don't have to. But
Okay.
what are the situations where these dogs are ending up in the shelters? Like, how do these dogs
um,
get here? Because I think people sometimes
yeah,
don't understand why the shelters are overcrowded.
large majority of dogs coming into a county shelter are either strays that were picked up from animal control, so meaning a dog is just roaming the streets,
Hmm.
either got out of the yard or somebody just didn't care enough and just let their dog go. Large majority is stray dogs that are then not claimed, or it is dogs that are being pulled from a cruelty or neglect case. So mostly
Mm.
it's animal control that are bringing the dogs in. You know, of course, every percentage is different, but at the most recent shelter that I worked at, I want to say that was about 85 to 90% of our intake was just strays or dogs that were pulled from cruelty, with maybe a small amount of them being surrenders.
Hmm.
And even on that note, the large majority, of course, there are people who don't care about their dogs, and there's like, whatever, I'm just gonna drop them off the shelter and whatever, don't even care about it. But the large majority of people that I witnessed having to surrender their dog to the shelter, they have no other option.
Yeah.
It's they lost their home, they're living in their car, they tried rehoming their dog, nobody came for it. You know,
Yeah.
they don't have housing, they don't have money, or there is a domestic violence case and someone needs to move across the country. I mean, there's a lot of really, really upsetting reasons as to why a person might need to surrender their dog. But more times than not, people are doing it, and it's their last resort, and they're really really upset about it.
100%. Yeah. So, what are some of the issues these dogs are facing as a result of living in the shelter? Do you find that they recover well after being adopted into a home?
Definitely. Of course, like it's hard to say because every dog is an individual. So,
Yeah.
sometimes I've met dogs who lived in shelter for over a year, and even in shelter, like they were totally fine. Like they had zero issues. They were placed into a home. They like were totally cool about it. No issues, no behavioral issues at all. Not even any issues in the shelter. They seemed unfazed by what happened to them. Whereas we've also met dogs who, within 2 weeks at the shelter, have completely fallen apart.
Hmm.
So it's really dependent on the dog. In terms of a behavioral issue, I do find a lot of frustration based reactivity developing in a
Sure.
shelter, and then being present in a home. I have a lot of clients who were recently adopted who struggle with just like general reactivity on leash, because the dogs are of course trapped in their kennel. They're watching dogs walk past them all day, every day. They're frustrated. They start barking, and then that behavior obviously quickly just kind of manifests into leash reactivity. But
Yeah.
of course, every dog is different. Something that I always mention is I believe there was a study a few years back that discovered a dog who spends average length of stay in shelter, which is about 2 weeks, will develop hearing loss,
Oh,
which
wow.
is yeah, really like so sad, and but like also so like something to really think about. That the kennel rooms are so loud.
Yeah.
I mean, if you've never been in a kennel room, especially like first thing in the morning before the dogs have gotten breakfast, like it's impossible to even describe how loud the rooms are. But I do remember taking a course years ago that mentioned the sound decibels in a typical shelter kennel room is equivalent to a jackhammer. So
Mm,
like makes sense.
yeah.
My ears would be ringing after 5 minutes of doing something in a kennel room. So I can imagine that after a few weeks of living in one, you would have some hearing loss.
Yeah, for sure. But I think it's important for people to realize like there's this perception that it's a real risk getting a dog from a shelter. But if you get a puppy from a breeder, it's going to be a perfect dog. And it's like there's a risk whenever you bring an animal into your home. You never know, right?
Yeah, you
Puppies are
you can't
not blank
predict the
slates.
behavior.
Yep,
Yeah.
puppies are not blank slates. I have a lot of reactive dog clients, aggressive dog clients that got them as puppies from a breeder, and worked with plenty of shelter dogs who, like you said, just seemed unfazed and really adjusted well to their new homes. So every dog's an individual, and you want to approach them as an individual for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, for
So,
sure.
what can people expect if they do adopt a shelter dog?
This is like the hardest question because it's like really anything and everything. You can expect to adopt a shelter dog, and the dog that you met in the shelter, that's the dog that you have now. And it's all great. That's the dog that you met and adopted. But more times than not, and I hate to say it, because it sometimes I find will scare people out of adopting shelter dogs, is that shelter behavior is a lot of times not very close to how a dog may behave when they are out of the shelter.
100%.
Like not even close. More like I said, there are, of course are those cases where dogs are like totally fine in shelter, happy go lucky, and then they get home and they're like the same thing.
Yeah.
But more times than not, a dog, we might see dogs who are fully shut down, and like even like I've done assessments on them, and I'm like semi-feral question mark, like so shut down and so completely just disengaged with humans that it almost seems like they've had zero socialization whatsoever. And then we place them in a home, and then like we get an update, and like they're like normal. So it's like it was the environment that was so hard for them. And then I've also seen dogs in shelter who were like quote unquote perfect angels, right? And then they go into a home and start displaying massive behavioral issues. I actually have a lot of clients who I have actually 3 clients right now who recently adopted dogs within the past year from a shelter. They were those like quote unquote perfect angels in the shelter, and then they developed pretty massive behavioral issues. once they were in the home, I want to say two of the dogs had kennel cough when they adopted them. So I
Okay.
think that was also something to consider, is that a lot of the dogs, when you are adopting them, are sick
Mm.
with a cold, or they are just not feeling their best. They're also really tired and lethargic, and just, I mean, kind of going through it. So you might find that, oh, this dog is really low energy. That's great. Like, this is a young puppy and it's really low energy. But in reality, the dog has, kennel cough, or some other type of a sickness, and then they recover, and then they feel better, and and then they now have a lot of energy.
Yeah.
Or again, vice versa. You might find a dog who's bouncing off the walls in a kennel, and then they get home and they're like pretty low energy because they have what they need. So it's really hard to say. It's a quite a toss up, I find, when you do adopt a shelter dog.
Yeah. And again, I'll say that about a puppy too. And you'll, be a year and a half into raising this dog before you really see what they're really like, right? Like
Oh
they have to
yeah.
go through their puppyhood and their adolescence and, into maturity. And then you're like, okay, now I get to meet my dog.
Oh yeah.
So,
Yes.
you can have some influence during the socialization period and things, and that's great. But yeah, a lot of it is genetics and temperament and things you just really can't predict. So
Yeah.
I think it is good to know that, like, they're sentient beings and they change throughout their life just like you do. And and behavior is specific to situations. So that's the
Oh,
thing about
absolutely.
the shelters when you're saying, and I always tell my clients when they're bringing home a dog, I'm like, they seem really chill now. Give them a month, give them 2 months, we'll see what it's like. But it's always great because that means they feel safe. They're
Oh,
starting to feel
absolutely.
safe and they can show you what they really feel like.
Yeah, like, keep an open mind.
If you would like a behavior consultation with Jenna, you can reach her at her website, thefutureisforcefree.com. You can follow her on Instagram at thefutureisforcefree. We'll be right back. Are a lot of the dogs in the shelters young?
Yes, that's actually something else to realize, is that large majority of dogs that come into shelters are average 9 months old.
Wow.
I believe, don't quote me on the statistics, but I'm really bad at like remembering numbers. But I was reading some study of something recently, and it was the large percentage of the dogs coming into shelter were adolescent dogs, so about 9 months old, 6 to 12 months of age. And a lot of times it's that typical, why is a 9 month old young dog roaming the streets all of a sudden? And it's because somebody maybe gets a young puppy. They're like, oh, cute
Mm-hmm.
puppy, love it. And then it turns into a teenager, and they're like, oh, never mind.
Yep.
And they just kind of either let it go, or it gets out, and they just like, or like, whatever, it was
It's
it was an
so
annoying
sad.
teenage dog. But yeah, it is really sad too, to even also think most dogs are adolescents, and that's when dogs need the most enrichment
Support. Yep.
and support. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're trapped in a teeny kennel with nothing to do for upwards
Oh,
of several
man.
months to a year.
I do have an episode in a previous season about adolescent dogs. If you guys who are listening are struggling with a teenager, it is a rough stage, but it does end. Um, they do grow up just like human teenagers. And, if you need some support, that, there's better options than just letting them roam the street and end up in the shelter. So now I'm going to ask the like trigger warning, you guys. If you want to turn this off, I'm about to ask, why do dogs in shelters get put down? Because we can't talk about shelter life and not talk about this reality.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's quite like always the elephant in the room, and a lot
So
of
yeah,
times we
trigger
don't.
warning.
Yeah,
If you don't want to listen to this, skip ahead.
yeah. And I hope that this can come off as educational,
Yes.
and like, of course, like it's almost sometimes like, I find it hard for me to talk about this because I've talked about it so much, and I've become so desensitized to it, and of course, like, working in shelters, my emotion is just kind of like taken out of it. I feel a lot of the time, but it is such a touchy subject to even talk about or think about.
But I
but
think
really
people don't
yeah.
understand it. So like,
Oh yeah.
yes, this is purely educational. Like we want you, if you're listening, to understand what happens in the shelters, and nobody wants to put dogs down. Why do we have to? Why does it happen?
Mhm.
It's reality.
Yeah. So the primary reason dogs are euthanized in shelter is due to lack of space. Once again, we're talking typical like county municipal shelter. It's
Yes.
more times than not lack of space. The municipal shelters or a county shelter, these shelters are required to take in every dog that animal control brings in. They typically do set a limit on owner surrenders, especially if they are full, which is pretty much
All the
100% of the
time.
time they're
Yeah.
full. But large majority of the dogs that come in anyways are strays or the dogs who are pulled from a neglect case of some sort. And for example, let's just say a shelter has 200 kennels. All of them are full. If not, there's maybe multiple dogs in some of those kennels. At the end of the day, 15 dogs come in from animal control, and 5 dogs were adopted or pulled from rescue. So that means there's 10 dogs who don't fit into a kennel. Let's just say. So at the end of the day, with that, there might be 10 dogs who are euthanized for space alone. Many times shelters in this case might choose to create a long-term resident list, and they go off of that list to just kind of simplify the process,
Mm,
because when you're making those decisions every single day, I think shelters prefer to just kind of have an easy system to go off of and an easy process, so they're not spending an hour at the end of each day like wrapping their brains around who it's going to be. They end up just having a list of the longest term residents, and longest term, I mean, depending on the shelter, this can be 3 weeks, this can be 3 months,
wow.
but that's about typical time frame is really about up to 3 months, if we're lucky. That's typical time frame that a dog might have the time on shelter, let's just say. So many times the shelters will choose to euthanize longest term residents, like daily, to
Mm,
simplify the process. Um, Now, outside of that, dogs might be euthanized for behavioral concerns. More than likely, it's high levels of aggression or reactivity. Speaking on aggression terms, if a dog is coming into a shelter and it's displaying extremely high levels of aggression, which is so hard because like they're scared and we
yeah.
know that aggression is fear based, so of
Yep.
course they're going to be aggressive.
Yeah.
So
We know it's a
you
semi-normal
understand.
response in
Yeah,
that
you
situation. Yep.
oh yeah, and it's like whenever I've worked with an aggressive dog, I'm like, I feel you, like I understand why you're doing
Yeah.
this, like I'm so sorry,
Yeah.
like this is so scary for you, and I fully almost like empathize with them because like I would probably be acting aggressively too if I was in their
Totally.
situation. But regardless, it's still a risk, and it's a safety risk for the staff. It's a safety risk for the other dogs, and it's a safety
It's a
risk for the
risk for
public.
a potential adopter.
Oh yeah, for
Yeah.
the public. If as a skilled professional, if I am like busting my ass to try to not get bit by a dog, as the professional that I am, I cannot then put that dog into the public and feel okay about it. Like that is
Correct.
extremely unethical for the dog and the person and everyone else in the public setting.
Yes.
So with that being said, regardless if a dog can overcome this or not, more times than not, these dogs are euthanized, kind of right off the bat. Shelters aren't going to see a point in wasting all of their resources on a massive behavior case when it's a liability and it's a risk to the public, and they're already euthanizing healthy and behaviorally sound dogs for space, you know. um that's sometimes always like the double-edged sword to think about is like, why, yes, we could spend a lot of resources and time helping this dog not be aggressive, um but why are we wasting all of our resources on this one dog when we just euthanized 10 dogs today who are fully behaviorally sound just for space alone? Like it
And
just
very
doesn't make
adoptable.
sense.
Yes.
Exactly. On the other hand, some dogs might be euthanized due to health reasons. If there's a massive medical concern that's expensive or difficult to treat, a shelter might choose to euthanize versus save. In the same way of like, why are we pouring resources into this dog, when we're already euthanizing healthy dogs? Um, Even if a dog might have like something minor, like once again, kennel cough, which is super common in the shelter. We might see a dog who has kennel cough, but is so stressed in the shelter that even with treatment, the dog is not recovering. So even if it's not a big health concern, or a big, like, expensive to treat health issue, if a dog isn't recovering from something
Mm,
like just a common cold, that dog might also be euthanized. So they stop spreading the sickness to everyone else.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
this is all really tough, and it's important for people to understand that it's like there are humans who have to do this on a daily basis in every shelter in the country, right?
Yeah.
And for some reason, I feel like they're being demonized. And
Oh
I
yeah.
want people to understand that these people are not making these choices because they want to. The
No.
shelters are, as you said, required to take every dog because they are funded by public funds, and they have limited resources because they only have whatever funds the government can give them. And it is people irresponsibly adopting and dumping, or, not securing their dogs or whatever, that are causing the overcrowding in these shelters and forcing these people to do these things. So I think it's really important. There's a lot of people that are like, they want to support quote unquote no kill shelters. And
Mm.
that's not really an option in municipal government run shelters. And that's why we're talking about this. I do want people to understand absolutely nobody goes into shelter work to kill dogs.
No, 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 no. But
It
yes,
breaks, it's
you're
like you
right.
said, it
Yeah.
breaks your heart. It causes, emotional fatigue, compassion fatigue. So we should be supporting these people in any way that we can. And a lot of the ways that we can do that, I think we can talk about now. But I think people just have to understand that this is the reality. And it doesn't mean the shelter is bad. The shelter is doing the function that the government has required it to do the best way that they can,
Yes.
and
And
trying to
it's I
keep everyone
really
safe.
I love to view it as like there's people on the sidelines watching a burning building, and they're like, wow,
Mm,
the building is burning and there's a bunch of people inside, and like that sucks, like that's horrible, like this is like they're like mad about the burning building. And then there's people like going in with water buckets that are also being demonized because they're trying to help the issue.
yeah.
So it's like it's a really silly, and I understand why people get mad at shelters, because it's like why are you euthanizing all of these dogs? So some shelters, I mean, have massively high euthanasia rates,
Mm,
given that like their save rate is lower than their euthanasia rate, right? So
mm,
I get why people might have that like nasty response to it, but even in those shelters, like they're doing everything that they possibly can, and it's just it will never be enough. Like
yeah.
nothing that a shelter could do, like I said, even the shelters that have a significant amount of resources,
Yeah.
they it still is not enough. Ever, it will never be enough for the crisis that we're
A
facing, really.
100%, which is what brings us to like our next question, which is bringing into the conversation rescues, right? So
Hmm.
rescues are privately funded organizations, so they run on
Yep.
donations usually, right? And rescues do go into shelters, like you mentioned, and pull dogs. And this helps because, of course, we're relieving some of the overcrowding, opening up some space for some other dogs to get a chance to get adopted. But I don't understand why a lot of people seem to think that shelters are bad and rescues are good. Again, in the
Right.
space, rescues are not as heavily regulated as shelters are. Uh, so I think there's a lot of opportunity for some bad actors in the space. To be
Hmm.
honest, I've heard some things about some rescues that I don't love.
Yeah.
But let's give everybody the benefit of the doubt. That's a different conversation,
Right.
and say, we're on the same team. But like, why is there this perception that like, oh, the shelter's bad and the rescues are good?
I would probably think that it's because rescues are pulling from shelters so dogs don't get euthanized, but then the shelters are euthanizing the dogs that the rescues are pulling. So a lot of times rescues are seen as like these saviors because they're pulling dogs off E-lists or euthanasia lists, so that they don't get euthanized. And then the shelters are like the bad place that these rescues are saving these dogs from, which of course they are.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that, like you said, like we're on the same team here. Like that doesn't mean that we have to badmouth either teams. It's just like there's one team doing one job and another team doing another job, and they benefit each other really
Right.
greatly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's just the notion in the same way as like no kill shelters are good and kill shelters are bad, but in reality they're the same thing. Kill and no kill is just a percentage, meaning that if you are an organization that has a save rate of 90% or higher, meaning that 90% of the animals that come in leave alive, then you are considered a no kill organization. Versus if you have a higher euthanasia rate or a lower save rate, then you're considered a kill shelter. So
Yeah.
it's really like, it's not that somebody opens a shelter and is like, I'm going to be a kill shelter or I'm going to be a no kill shelter. It's like literally just however the percentages lie.
Yeah.
And even if a rescue or a shelter is a quote unquote no kill shelter, they more than likely are still euthanizing dogs. They're just not euthanizing as many dogs.
Right.
Let's just say.
Yeah. And they're also, I think, more likely to place a dangerous dog
Yes.
than a kill shelter would, because like you said, I don't even like saying this word over and over again, but in a municipal shelter, it's like you said, a dangerous dog comes in that you guys know is dangerous, because that's a whole other thing. But that dog is going to get put down, and it's not going to get placed. Whereas the ones that are like, save them all, we have to save them all. It's like, not to the detriment of the family that now has a huge burden on themselves to keep themselves and this animal safe, or make the decision to euthanize them themselves. So, that can be just outsourcing the euthanasia to the adopters by placing dangerous animals. So, a well-run shelter is not going to do that. We're running out of time. But
I know we could like talk about this forever.
Yeah, so it's just to point out that like the main difference between shelters and rescues is that rescues have more resources. They have private resources, so sometimes they pull medical cases and raise money to do the surgery, etc., etc. But even rescues have limited resources.
Oh, absolutely.
I've had to try to help rehome a dog or a stray, and calling the rescues. I mean, they're all full at capacity, doing whatever they can as well. So it's a crisis in the space right now, and there really aren't enough homes for the amount of animals that are out there. There aren't.
No, there really isn't.
I am sorry to tell you, there are not enough homes for the number of animals that are out there. So that's just math wise, saving them all becomes very, very, very difficult. So let's end with, what do you wish, and maybe we already said it, but what do you wish people knew about the shelter system?
Yeah, I mean, I think we really did already say it, that I wish people knew that shelters and shelter workers aren't inherently bad, right? Like, people love to view shelters or even shelter workers as these dog killing machines. In reality, shelters are a vital piece of the puzzle here. The problem is that the piece of the puzzle that shelters fit in, the shelters were not built for the crisis that we're facing, right? So like the system that we're running on no longer can resolve the issue at hand. So it's really just the sense of like, shelters are doing quite literally everything that they possibly can, and unfortunately everything that we possibly can do just isn't enough. So it's really sad. And something else, on another hand, I wish people that would just understand that not supporting a kill shelter doesn't stop the killing. It actually makes it worse. If you 100%. Say, oh, they euthanize dogs, I'm not gonna support them. I'm not gonna give them my donation. I'm not gonna adopt from them. I'm not gonna volunteer. But it's not like they're like a business or something,
Right.
like that's gonna listen to this
Yep.
what people are saying. The more that you help, the more that you donate to them, the more that you go in and volunteer, the more that maybe you choose to adopt a dog from a place like that, that is going to lower the numbers, in the sense of, if I pull one dog out of a shelter, then one kennel opens up, and that's one less dog that maybe had to be euthanized that day.
100%. So let's end on like how people can help. You mentioned adopt a dog from a shelter. Fantastic. What about if you can't adopt, can you foster through a shelter, or do you usually have to foster through a rescue?
Oh, you can absolutely foster through a shelter.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so fostering is your second step after adopting. If you can't adopt, then go in and foster. A lot of shelters have programs that are like a couch surfers program, if you will, where a dog, like, oh my God, we are at max capacity, that we're going to have a bunch of rescues pull tomorrow, but tonight we have 10 dogs that don't have a kennel. Can you take them home for the weekend, or something like that? So even stuff like that, just kind of like holding on to dogs for a weekend or for even a day, so that they have one more day to get a chance at getting pulled from a rescue or something like that. It doesn't have to be long-term. Of course, you can also long-term foster, but really fostering a dog from a euthanasia list is incredibly helpful. Of course, not everyone can do that. So if you can't go in and foster a dog, if you don't have the space, or you have too many of your own dogs, then you can always go in and volunteer, or even donate. There's typically every shelter has a volunteer program that you can either go in and provide enrichment, or help clean, or even just walking in and doing something for the shelter workers is a massive help to them. Just for somebody to walk into a shelter and make a shelter worker feel seen and as if they are a good person and they're doing what they need to be doing is a huge, like, it seems so simple, but it really does a lot of times mean a lot.
Absolutely. Honestly, it's one of the hardest jobs I can think of. And it's incredible that there are people who can do that and have, again, the compassion and the distance not to be destroyed every single day. By doing that. Yeah. So that's a great idea.
What helped me the most, like whenever I have been working in shelters and I'm like, man, I'm having just a horrible day, and like a volunteer that I love would come in and like give me a hug, or like bring me a coffee, or just like tell me that I'm doing a good job, like that would truly like turn my entire day from horrible to maybe a little good. So really just offering support or like just love towards a shelter worker can go a long way.
Phenomenal. Or rescues, if you find a good reputable rescue, because if you can help pull a dog out, anyway. So if you have a relationship with the rescue, but again, they're not as well regulated, more opportunities for bad actors in that space. So if you can go directly to the shelter, that's fantastic.
And if you live in any county or any city, I'm sure there's a shelter right down the street. You know?
And if you're in Los Angeles, there's a lot.
Oh, I bet.
We got a bunch in LA County. Well, thank you so much for talking to us. It's not an easy topic. Thank you for all the work that you have done in the shelters and with the dogs that are being rescued out of them. Just thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was so fun to chat about.
Thank you for stopping by the dojo this week. This is your aspiring sensei, Susan Light, signing off. You can find me at doggydojopodcast.com, or I'm Susan Light LA on Instagram, Pinterest, and Facebook. The music was written by MacLight. You can find him at maclightsongwriter.com. If you like the show, you can support it by subscribing, sharing it with your friends, rating it, and reviewing it on Apple Podcasts. Just a reminder, this podcast is intended for educational purposes only and does not constitute advice or professional services by either the host or any of the guests. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another new episode of the Doggy Dojo.